to everyone viewing this video. My name is Ralph Johnson. I'm the immediate past president of the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, better known as CAS. And it is my pleasure to have an opportunity to talk with Dan Bureau, who serves as one of our past presidents. So Dan, tell us when you became president and when you served and just how you got involved with CAS.
Yeah, I was fortunate to be president in 2019 and 2021, so that 2-year span. I don't know if fortunate is the right term given that COVID happened during that time, and I can talk more about that later on, but certainly was a very challenging time for CAS. I had been on CAS since 2008. I was fortunate to have served as the president for the Association of Fraternity Sorority Advisors in 2004, and then when the opportunity to appoint an alternate to Doug Lange, who had served on CAS since 1982. Doug had been the only AFA liaison to CAS for about 30 years.
Wow.
Wow, you say that out loud, it's amazing. No, 20 years. But still, 20 years. And then they needed an alternate and they asked me and I said yes right away. I mean, CAS was always something I had on my radar, loved using them in my practice, and just was really excited to jump on. And it was a time too where lots of people on CAS have been around for a while. So it was an exciting group to come into and to learn from.
Right, you're absolutely right. That was that period when CAS involvement was a long-standing professional and, quite frankly, personal commitment.
Yeah.
And I do remember Doug very, very well. He served valiantly representing the Association of Fraternity Advisors, and the stuff that he did with that as the secretary of CAS was always really quite notable.
Spread across the minutes of CAS. There you go.
Right, exactly. Spread across the minutes. That was his famous phrase. So, Dan, just from your perspective, why is CAS important to higher education?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons, but first and foremost, there's no organization like CAS. There is no organization that connects higher education associations across shared purpose, and that shared purpose is to create expectations in order to enact effective programs and services. And what I will say is that the ability for us to come across as having that shared purpose across, right now we have 42 different associations, but right now, 42 associations can say that we have a common language we can talk about, we can use in our practice. We have common frameworks that unite us more than separate us. Oftentimes people look at student affairs functions in terms of their silos. And I think ultimately what CAS does is it broke down those silos. We're more than our standards, because I think it's really important to emphasize that the standards are core to what we do, but just the fact that these associations come together to meet and convene and to learn and to create parameters for how to do effective practice is really, really important and very unique in higher ed. The other thing I will say too is that the interdisciplinary nature benefits us because you have people from across these associations looking at these sets of standards. So whether it be residential life or academic advising or campus activities, whatever kinds of sort of standards we're talking about, you're going to have people from the College Reading Learning Association or from the LGBT Consortium or from NASPA or ACPA looking at them as well. And I think that ability to come together to create standards, to create an interdisciplinary approach to the work, and to create connections is really important and very unique to the higher ed space.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And Dan, you're in a unique situation in that you are a past president who has returned to the council. And so you really demonstrated a true commitment to CAS and the work that we do. But I'm curious to know, as you are still a very active student affairs professional, how do you use CAS in your daily work?
Yeah, and so it's important to know too, maybe how I came up through student affairs that kind of informs my application of CAS, because I think that why I chose to stay on the governing board is a direct result of some of the career decisions that I've made. And so I spent the first 10 years of my career, I've been in higher education since 1996. And I spent the first 10 years working in fraternity and sorority life, leadership programs and student organizations at a few campuses. Had done some, light CAS reviews, knowing what I know now, I wasn't really doing it the right way or the way that CAS might recommend. But what I will say is that I was integrating standards into my work even back then. Now, not necessarily as part of a divisional program review model, but I was using them at the University of Illinois to, ascertain the extent to which I was enacting fraternity story-like programs that were really making a difference in the lives of students. And at that point in time, too, CAS did not have a strong orientation towards learning and development, which we developed more around those late 2000s. So early on, it was really about building out the programs and services. I think when I come on to CAS in 2008, my identity had shifted into a full-time doc student. And I was working at Indiana University at the National Survey of Student Engagement. And I had done 10 years as a practitioner. I was looking to see what I wanted to do next. And what I really found in doing CAS work on top of my doctoral work was that I had this real strong interest in measuring effectiveness.
Right.
Wanting to know why programs make a difference, why they matter, how they should be created in ways that are more intentional. I think that CAS is a great tool to practice intentionality. And so for me, that point around 2008, as I'm wrapping up doc work and I go to my first job as the Director of Student Affairs Learning and Assessment at the University of Memphis, I start seeing how CAS is a beneficial tool. And so I'm applying it in some cases to, small scale program reviews for some departments. I would work with my teams, for example, in parent and family programs at University of Memphis to review the standards, to talk about ways we might build out the programs and a staff of two. How might they enact these and prioritize and those kinds of things as well. And so for me, the use of the standards has been both from a review to create new programs, review to assess, sometimes formally, sometimes less formally. And here at Louisiana State University, where I'm currently employed, we are starting to enact a program review model that will use CAS. We've done a little bit of that in a couple departments, but this fall we will launch. Our first effective program review across the division. And so really for me as a practitioner, I've always defaulted to the CAS standards, but being on the CAS Council has really helped me to use these as like a framework for all that I do.
So which standards were new or added while you were on the council and or served on the governing board? I know that's probably a lot to ask you to remember, but just if you can think about some of those, what would they be?
Yeah. Well, I think I can, because what I will say is I've been on the council now for 17 years, 16 years. And my first true volunteer experience in CAS was to create the parent and family standards. That was my first committee appointment in 2009. And I loved working with the AHEP folks on that process. We were creating brand new standards. Then I did a little bit of work at academic advising in the early 2010s, which was not new, but that was the buffer between doing parent and family, which was new, and then transfer student services, which was new when we worked on them in 2011. And when NISTS first became a member of CAS around that time also. So sometimes you see like AHEP or NISTS or HECMA for case management, those associations join CAS because of their commitment to wanting to create standards. And so, let's see what else. And so I was part of those. I did campus card credentials, which was brand new. I chaired that committee. So, we've seen the evolution of CAS standards beyond the traditional student affairs kinds of areas,
Right.
campus activities, fraternity story advising, residential life. But we've also expanded them into other aspects of, like, for example, experiential learning. So you have experiential learning and internships, as well as career. Or in the health and well-being space, we've moved in some ways from having standards called, campus recreation to collegiate recreation. So we've even changed some of the language around existing sets of standards. But I mean, yeah, we've created in the last 16 years brand new sets of standards for case management, for esports, for campus credentials, for testing. That was another new set of standards that we've been a part of. Assessment services, I think, may have been developed right around the time I came onto the board. But student affairs assessment alone as a standing office was becoming a new thing around that time as well. So I've been able to be a part of lots of sets of standards revisions, but also fortunate to be involved in the creation of new standards for parent and family, transfer, those kinds of areas, campus credential.
Yeah, and I recall very much how you really helped us process the whole concept of where assessment ought to be in the cycle. And we made some adjustments relative to those recommendations. And I think it really served the standards very well.
It's interesting too, Ralph, because, CAS has long been known for its self-assessment, its self-study products. What I will say though is as an organization, I'm not sure that we were necessarily viewed as contributing to the larger student affairs assessment discourse, in all honesty, not the same way that we needed to be. And I do credit Gavin Henning for coming in and really connecting us more with the student affairs assessment leaders, for example, or connecting us more with the NASPA and ACPK knowledge community and commission. So it is interesting to see one of the ways that CAS has really grown as an organization beyond just developing standards that happen to be assessment tools, was that aligning ourselves more with this idea of like continuous improvement and ongoing assessment of effectiveness, efficiencies, those kinds of things. I will also say too that I think that CAS is a tool to do small scale assessments, small A assessment, so more like this day-to-day examination about how we do our practice is something more and more that I lean into talking to people, because I think that the self-studies are great, but they're very rigorous in their nature.
Right.
And there's multiple ways to do it. People always want to follow the prescription that we might have around CAS. But when you think about CAS as a tool just for ongoing determination if programs are working or what we're doing and how we should prioritize things, these are things you take off the shelf. You can look at them and use them. Or right now, you actually just pull up the PDF, right? Because it's no longer a book. And so you can use our tools to do an examination almost on the daily about how CAS is working or how your programs are working.
Absolutely. As you think about your term as president, what are some of the major accomplishments that you think CAS was able to get done under your leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, there's only been, I think, 11 presidents of CAS in its 45 years, right? Is it
Right.
11? Yeah,
Yes, I
right.
was 10th, so yes.
Right, yeah, I'm 9, you're 10,
You're right.
you know, and it's interesting to think about just what the president does in that space and how CAS as an organization has really changed. And, you know, I totally stand on the shoulders of the ones that came before me. You know, Laura Dean, I often joke that she's my muse, right? Because she's the person that really taught me how to sit and listen and synthesize and really take in things and determine priorities. So I'm very grateful for the presidents that came before me. So when I say what I think I did well or what the priorities were, it's not to diminish what was there before, but really is to just say that like we couldn't be where we were when I took presidency without the work that they all put forth. And you know, CAS at one point was a sit around the table and wordsmith organization. And by the time I became president, and Gavin as well before, we had moved away from that kind of model, which
Right.
allowed us to be more thinking about how we might be positioned differently in the higher education discourse around effectiveness and just general like learning development and those kinds of things, you know. And so what I think about with my time, and I came in November of 19, so you president-elect in 2018 to 19, Gavin's president at that point. I come in November of 2019. We come to Memphis, we have a governing board retreat in February of 2020, and the world shuts down a month later. And so here we were in a space where we were thinking about the future of the organization. We had just lost our executive director. We were newly coupled with an association management company. And so, you know, and I want to step back for a second and just honor Mary Beth kind of in this context because, you know, as our first full-time executive director, you know, Phyllis was our first executive director and I love Phyllis, but Mary Beth was taking us to kind of new levels and just think about her often, what she did for CAS and her memory is so with us, obviously, but what I will say about the time we were in is we were trying to rethink about ourselves as an organization, period, let alone from the standards work. And so what COVID, I think, positioned us to do differently was to convene dialogues across associations in a time where we were all trying to figure out how to still do the work. And I don't want to maybe overstate kind of how much we were involved in that, but I do feel like we connected people a lot. We had several virtual meetings, brought together the associations, talked about what we were dealing with, and really address some of the issues we're facing as a student affairs, student services field. And I think CAS continues to do that work and attend to that. But I think being president during that time allowed us to kind of really think differently about how we serve higher ed at large. And while that had started a little bit, I think, under Gavin's leadership, what I will say is that Gavin brought us more aligned with assessment at large in the field. I think what I was able to do was carry the momentum around assessment because of my background, but also my ability to kind of create connections and collaborations. I mean, the things that I'm good at are arranging, bringing people together and figuring out how all the pieces work. And so end of the day, I was able to do a lot of that during COVID. And we were doing a lot of it like this on screen. The other thing I think that was really powerful during that time was so we had just gone through some strategic planning work. We were trying to figure out what we are as an organization. And I think during that time, we were thinking too about how we tap into markets more in the accreditation and continuous improvement space, into institutional effectiveness space. And I think that moving from this idea of an assessment tool to a continuous improvement product, I think is something that started coming to fruition during that time as well. I will also say that during that time, I think Ralph, you and I, we're the longest serving people on CAS right now. And that fall 19 meeting was so interesting because we lost some of our longest standing people, like Pat Coretta retired in fall of 19. We had just lost Deb Garrett and Laura Dean and all of these folks who had transitioned off of CAS. And so we were in a space too that not only were we navigating like a virtual world, questioning our purpose, how do we come together, but we're starting to see a lot more turnover in terms of the reps that are showing up on the TV screen or in the virtual space once we get back together again. So what I will say too is that managing onboarding and getting people involved in how you can really make a difference in CAS looks really different when half the room is brand new versus prior to it, when you and I first came on, where it was like the people that had been there forever had been there forever. That didn't happen. So I think during my years, those are the things I would point to. I would say that COVID kind of covers most of my 2019, 2021, but as we're coming out of it, I do think we're able to transition to a place where I think, thanks to you, I think one of the greatest skills you have is your attention to operations. And so I think you were able to come in and also kind of start implementing some of the strategic initiatives that we had talked about in a time where we were coming into like higher ed was just rethinking what it should be doing, period. So I think I'll stop there, but those are the things I think that really stand out to me. We also, I would also want to point out too, that we added the member at large for diversity, equity, and inclusion during that time.
Exactly, right.
We revised our standards in order to be more aligned with equitable conditions in terms of our working environments, those kinds of things. And so I think some of the revisions around our standards during that time are really important also.
Right. And even though, and correct me if I'm wrong, you may not have actually been president yet, you were highly influential in us moving to the AMC model.
I was, yeah.
And creating that process. You want to speak a little bit about that? Because that was really quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, I remember sitting in at New England College in that room. Gavin was president at the time, and we were talking about after Mary Beth passed and Deb Garrett was providing interim executive director leadership for us. We were like, we don't need a full-time executive director, but we need all these things.
Right.
So how do we make that happen? It was fortunate that I had understanding of the AMC world, being married to someone who works in the AMC world. And I kind of understood association management pretty well from some of the stuff I'd done as AFA president. So what I will say there too was that the decision to move to an AMC was pivotal for us because we could not afford to build out the infrastructure that we needed. We didn't need it at the levels that would require X full-time people. We needed to be able to be flexible and pivot, right? I mean, coincidentally, the idea of an AMC is to pivot sometimes on the things that are priorities. And if you have 3 people that are your full-time staff and all their tasks with doing is like event planning or executive director or membership, or, I'm using this broadly for an association. If you have those buckets, you can't lean into the fact that at some points in the year, you don't need one of those buckets that much. And I know in CAS, we really needed to have like different times of the year, different kinds of functions being served. The AMC process was very competitive, and we looked at a lot of different organizations, and we were fortunate to land with AMC Source. And I think we benefited from their good work and Doreen's leadership in terms of the executive director also. And also wonderful to know that at this point, 4 years later, we've been able to build out that model in a way that enhances our FTE and has Doreen as a full-time executive director.
Right. Well, I just wanted to acknowledge your contribution, and I really appreciate the fact that you brought that concept to us at a time that we really needed it, that slightly preceded your presidency, but you were able to really help us transition into that when you were president. So I really appreciate that very much. And don't forget your contribution of bringing Sal to the table in a more significant way. So you want to touch on that for just a moment?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And really, I remember sitting in a room with, actually, even before Sal, it was like, and Campus Labs, bringing Campus Labs more into the fold with Anna Meek and them. And so when Gavin was president, what I always thought that had we been fully what we could have been as an organization in CAS, we might have been Sal. So Sal is a membership-based, zero pay. There's no cost to be a member of Sal, but it's for Student Affairs Assessment Leaders. Okay, that's the acronym SAAL. They've been around since probably 2009, and I had been engaged with them a little bit when I was Director of Student Affairs Learning and Assessment and have stayed connected to that world. But the reason why Sal was so important to CAS was they are the people doing the work that use our standards.
Right.
And in most cases, when we're talking about program review, the people that are coordinating that will be someone that has divisional student affairs assessment responsibilities. And so more intentionally engaging with them was launched by Gavin. I do think we brought them in a little bit differently. I remember having some great conversations with Nicole Long, who was the chair at that point. We brought Martha Glass on as the ACPA representative to CAS. She had been on SAL also, so and had a student affairs assessment background. And so we were having these discussions about just how important it was for us to more commit to each other as organizations. Post my presidency, I think is when we really had the most gain and kind of traction in that relationship. And now we're very deeply connected to SAL in terms of creating information, communications, education, providing them with some money in order to fund some staffing for what they're doing. That commitment to SAL, I think, pays dividends to CAS because it builds awareness of student affairs assessment as a really important part of the higher education landscape.
Great. Appreciate that. So as you begin thinking about the future of CAS, what would your assessment be relative to where we are versus where we need to be?
Yeah. I mean, I think CAS is doing very well. I mean, I think right now is a scary time for higher education associations, period. And the benefit for CAS, though, is that we don't have like doomsday scenarios. I mean, we're not a member-based organization. The doomsday for us is when people no longer find our products relevant.
Right.
That is not currently the case. What CAS has to do, though, is figure out how to better help people use our products so that they feel less intimidating, or that they are trained on them, because a lot of student affairs and student services folks nowadays don't come up through graduate preparation programs the way they used to.
Right.
I also think that grad prep programs aren't necessarily training on CAS the way we think they were 10 years ago either. So we need to do more work in order to get into the mindsets and awareness for like institutional effectiveness folks or vice presidents of student affairs or whatever we call it on that campus, student success, whatever. We have to get into the mindset that like we are an essential tool beyond just the self-study piece. So that's where I'm going to lean in and say, you know, I've done easily 100 sessions on CAS between AFA sessions, NASPA, ACPA, webinars. I've easily done 100 trainings on CAS. And even recently, the last year, I've been thinking about how to talk about it differently. You know, and CAS has this model for program review, but end of the day, what really matters most is culture and context of the user. And so for me, I'm trying to help users use them in more effective and creative ways. And so I'm having lots of conversations about doing like program reviews in different ways that honor divisional structures and those kind of things. I also want people to think about CAS being used for creating new offices or rethinking priorities, or, you know, what if a division of student affairs were to tell all of its departments to read part 2, which is programs, our most substantive part, and pick 2 priorities for the year. I mean, it's a whole planning model. It's a real attention to really being like, it's attention to being more intentional by using the standards. I think that's what we have to lean into. Beyond just using our products for program review, it has to be that we are the structures and the frameworks they use in order to enact good practice in higher education in a really demanding time.
Okay, great. So is there anything else you'd like to share about your experience on CAS for those 17 plus years, and particularly during your presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say just how um I really like I really like being part of this organization. I think it's meant a lot to me as it has to you. I think both of us have felt that this is a defining moment for us in our professional careers.
Right.
You mentioned
Indeed.
earlier about how I took on another role after I was in my presidency. I wasn't ready to leave and I wasn't ready to stop contributing. And
Right.
it might sound selfish, but actually I had a lot to give. And we kind of reconfigured a position, and it was the right position for me to be in because of my background. So, but I think that the organization really matters. I think the relationships we build are so pivotal to
Mhm.
really doing good work in higher education. The fact that I can, it's interesting. I currently supervise disability services here at LSU, but my relationships with Anne and Jill from ahead as the reps have always been very solid. So I know when I need something relative to like helping me here, I might reach out to the head representatives that are on CAS. I mean, I
Right.
view them as experts in that space. And so it's about relationships. I think what we have to do as an organization, though, is help other people recognize how those relationships can be important to them, how they can ever create them as well, because not everyone can be on CAS. And that is the unfortunate part. But end of the day, I know that these relationships really, really matter to me, and I'm just grateful to have had the time I've had. I've got a few more years left. I don't think I'm ending probably a couple more years at least. But what I will say is that I'll look back on this because of the people, the processes, the accomplishments were many, the challenges were many. But end of the day, we are an organization that matters to higher ed in a really specific, unique way. And I think CAS has a lot to be proud of in this 45th year.
Well, I appreciate that. And Dan, as has become my closing tagline for all of these conversations, thank you so very much for receiving the baton of leadership from Gavin Henning.
Yes.
And then I am most grateful that you were so gracious in passing it on to me and the way that you transitioned me into that role. And the first time that ever happened was to assemble all of the living past presidents on a call and gave them an opportunity to give me advice as I stepped into the role. And you have no idea how much that meant to me personally and professionally. So thank you again for that opportunity. And thank you for being the president and the person that you are.